I was 26 years old the first time I saw Caleb, and he was standing behind his father's leg like a shadow that hadn't quite decided if it wanted to exist. Tom had told me about him, of course, over coffee, over our second and third dates, in the careful, guarded way men talk about the parts of their lives they're afraid will scare you off. "I have a son," he'd said. "He's 4. His mother left when he was 18 months old. It's just been the two of us." I remember thinking, that's a lot to carry into a relationship. And then I remember thinking, right on the heels of it, so is he. Tom wasn't a complicated man. He fixed things, literally, for a living, and emotionally, by sheer stubbornness. He didn't talk about Renee much, and when he did, there wasn't bitterness in his voice, just a kind of tired confusion, like a man still trying to solve a math problem that didn't have a rational answer. She'd left a note, not even a long one. She'd said she wasn't built for this life, and she was sorry, and she hoped he'd understand someday. He never did. But he stopped waiting for it to make sense, and he put all his energy into the small, sturdy body of his son. The day I met Caleb, he had a scrape on his knee that Tom had bandaged badly, the gauze already peeling at one corner, and he was clutching a plastic dinosaur so tightly his knuckles had gone pale. He didn't smile at me. He didn't even really look at me. He just watched, the way small children do when they've already learned that adults come and go, and it's safer to wait and see which kind you are. I didn't try to win him over that day. I've never trusted people who try too hard to be liked by children. Kids can smell desperation, and it makes them wary, not warm. So I just sat down on the porch steps, at his level, not above him, and asked if the dinosaur had a name. "Rex," he said, like I was an idiot for asking. "Of course he is," I said. "All the good ones are named Rex." He almost smiled. Almost. It took months before he'd let me read to him at bedtime instead of just sitting in the room while Tom did it. It took a year before he'd hold my hand crossing the street without being asked. It took 2 years before he called me anything at all besides nothing. He just addressed me directly. Never a name. Like I existed in his world but hadn't yet been given a label he was ready to use. I want to be clear about something, because I think people who haven't lived it don't always understand. I never tried to replace his mother. I never once told him I loved him more than she did, or that she didn't deserve him, or any of the small cruelties a lesser person might have used to secure her place. I just showed up. Every single day. That was the whole strategy, if you could call it that. Showing up on the days he had a fever and the days he didn't. Showing up for the school play where he was the third tree from the left. Showing up when he broke his arm falling off the Petersons' fence and screamed for his dad the whole ambulance ride, and I sat in the front seat and didn't take it personally, because I understood even then that love isn't a competition you win by being chosen first. It's a thing you build, brick by brick, on the days nobody's watching. The day he finally called me Mom, really called me it, not a slip of the tongue, but on purpose, looking right at me. He was 6, and he'd had a nightmare, and he came into our room at 2 in the morning and said, "Mom, there's a spider," and then stopped, like he'd surprised himself. Tom was dead asleep. I got up, checked the room, found no spider, real or imagined, and sat with him until he fell back asleep, with his hand wrapped around my finger. I didn't tell him what that word meant to me. I didn't make it a moment. I just let it become normal, the way the truest things in a family usually do, quietly, without announcement, until one day you look up and 18 years have passed and you can't remember a version of your life where he wasn't yours. By the time he started 1st grade, I'd married Tom. By the time he started 3rd grade, I stopped correcting people who assumed I'd given birth to him. It stopped feeling like a lie. It started feeling like the truest thing I'd ever said. I want you to remember this part of the story, the beginning, because everything that happens later only makes sense if you understand what came before it. I didn't raise Caleb because I had to. Tom never forced my hand, never made staying contingent on my devotion to his son. I raised him because somewhere in those early years, in the reading and the bandaging and the 2 a.m. spider hunts, he stopped being Tom's son and became simply mine. I didn't know yet what that word would cost me. I didn't know that 18 years of showing up could be erased in the length of time it takes to hand someone a microphone. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That's still a long way off. For now, I just want you to picture a woman on a porch step, offering a small boy the dignity of being taken seriously about his dinosaur's name, having no idea that she'd just started the work of a lifetime. Tom's construction business did well in the early years. Well enough that we bought a modest house with a yard big enough for Caleb to break bones in, which, true to form, he eventually did. The fence jumping incident, and later a memorable skateboard disaster that required 11 stitches and a stern lecture about helmets he did not take seriously. Things changed when Caleb was 11. A recession hit, contracts dried up, and Tom, who had built his whole identity around being the man who provided, started coming home with a particular look on his face. The one men get when the ledger in their head stops balancing, no matter how many times they run the numbers. He never said much about it. He wasn't a man who complained. He just worked longer hours for less money and started declining invitations to things that cost money we didn't have. I'd been a receptionist at a dental office, a fine, unremarkable job that let me pick Caleb up from school and be home for dinner. When the business started struggling, I took a second job without much discussion. Evening shifts 3 nights a week at a hospital, doing intake paperwork and insurance verification. Work that was tedious, but paid decently, especially with the shift differential. I want to be honest about what those years looked like, because I think there's a version of this story people expect, noble suffering, a martyr's smile. And that's not quite it. Some nights I was resentful. Some nights I sat in the hospital break room at 11 p.m. eating a vending machine sandwich, and I let myself be furious for exactly 10 minutes about the vacation we weren't taking, the car that needed a repair I kept postponing, the fact that I hadn't bought a new pair of shoes in 2 years that weren't for a specific practical purpose. I gave myself permission to be angry, and then I clocked back in and finished my shift. Because anger doesn't pay a mortgage, and it definitely doesn't pay for braces. Somewhere around Caleb's freshman year of high school, I did something I never told Tom about. Not because I was hiding it exactly, but because I didn't want it to become a conversation. I opened a savings account in my own name, not our joint account, mine, and I started putting a portion of every hospital paycheck into it. $50 some weeks, $100 if I'd picked up extra shifts. I told myself it was for emergencies. I think, if I'm honest with myself now, I already knew what it was really for. Caleb was smart. Genuinely, unmistakably smart. The kind of smart that teachers pull parents aside about, using words like potential in a tone that makes it clear they mean something specific and significant. He wanted to go to college, a real 4-year college, not the community college route that would have been easier on all of us financially. He talked about engineering, then business, then engineering again, the way 17-year-olds do, trying on futures like jackets in a store. Tom wanted to give him that. God, he wanted to. But contracting work doesn't come with the kind of steady, bankable income that colleges look kindly on. And by the time Caleb was filling out applications, it was clear that between financial aid and what we could scrape together as a family, there was going to be a gap. A significant one. I never told either of them about the account. I kept working me extra shifts. I picked up hospital holidays other nurses' spouses complained about because the pay was double and nobody else wanted them. And it turns out, selling Christmas Eve to a coworker with young kids at home is an easy, quiet way to build a college fund, one holiday shift at a time. By the time Caleb got his acceptance letter, a good school, a real one, the kind with a name that made his guidance counselor actually stand up from her desk, I had enough in that account to cover the gap. Not comfortably, not with room to spare, but enough. I remember the conversation with Tom, where we figured out the finances for the first semester. He was doing math on the back of an envelope, the way he always did, brow furrowed. And he said, "I don't know how we're going to make this work, Diane." And I said, "We'll make it work," in a tone that I hoped sounded like faith and not like someone who already had the answer sitting quietly in an account he didn't know existed. I let him believe it was coming together through some combination of financial aid, his overtime, and a home equity loan we did eventually take out for a portion of it. I let him carry the weight of thinking he was the one solving it, because Tom's sense of himself as a provider had already taken so many hits over the years, and I didn't need credit. I want to be honest about that. It wasn't strategic generosity on my part. I genuinely didn't think about it much at the time. I was just doing what needed doing, the way I'd always done, quietly, in the background. The way you top off a car's oil without announcing it, not because you're a saint, but because the car needs oil and you're the one who noticed. I paid the first semester's gap myself from that account, and the second. And by the time Caleb was a junior, it had become an unspoken arrangement. Tom handled some of it, I handled the rest. And neither Caleb nor Tom ever asked exactly how the math worked out each semester, because 18-year-olds and stressed contractors alike are not known for auditing family finances closely, especially when things simply, mysteriously, keep working out. I worked that second job for 6 years. I want you to sit with that number for a second, because it's easy to say I worked hard for my stepson's education as a sentence, and it's a different thing entirely to picture 6 years of missed dinners, 6 years of falling asleep in scrubs I never should have worn to bed, 6 years of a body that ached in ways I pretended not to notice because there wasn't time to address it. I never once thought of it as a sacrifice while I was making it. I thought of it as being a mother. Those felt like the same word to me. I didn't yet understand that other people might not agree. Renee was never gone, exactly. She was more like weather. Unpredictable, occasionally severe, impossible to plan around. For the first several years, she was truly absent. No calls, no cards, nothing. Then, around Caleb's 8th birthday, a card arrived, out of nowhere. No return address, just a generic happy birthday card with $40 folded inside, and a short note in handwriting Tom recognized immediately, his face going very still when he saw it. Caleb was old enough by then to ask who it was from. Tom told him the truth, that it was from his birth mother, and watched his son's face do something complicated that neither of us fully understood at the time. After that, she became a kind of irregular presence. A card most years, though not every year. A phone call around his 11th birthday that Tom took in the garage with the door shut, coming back inside afterward looking like a man who'd been hit somewhere soft. A single visit when Caleb was 13. She came to town for what she said was a work trip, took him to lunch at a nice restaurant, bought him a video game console he'd been wanting, and then didn't contact him again for almost 2 years. I was never cruel about Renee. I want that on the record. I never spoke badly of her to Caleb, never rolled my eyes at her cards, never made him choose. Partly because I genuinely believed a child deserves to know and love his birth mother, if that's available to him, in whatever form it takes. And partly, if I'm honest, because I didn't feel threatened. I had 18 years of bedtime stories and school pickups and stitches at the ER. She had a handful of expensive lunches and a talent for arriving right when it would leave the biggest impression. But I noticed things, especially as Caleb got older. Renee, whatever her failures as a consistent parent, had money. Real money, from a second marriage to a man who owned a chain of car dealerships. And she'd developed a talent for the kind of parenting that costs nothing but cash and requires no daily labor. Concert tickets, a designer jacket for his 16th birthday, a surprise visit his junior year where she took him and 3 of his friends to a Lakers game with courtside seats. There is a particular kind of magic that absence plus money can create in a teenager's mind, and I watched it happen to Caleb, slowly, the way you watch weather change on the horizon before it reaches you. He started talking about her differently. Not, "my mom left when I was a baby" anymore, but My mom's really successful, and my mom said she'd help me find an internship. And once, in an offhand comment that landed like a slap I don't think he meant to deliver, it's cool getting to know my real family. I didn't say anything in the moment. I've thought about that a lot since, whether I should have. But what was I going to say? I'm your real family too? It felt undignified to have to argue the point. I told myself he was 17, that teenagers are drawn to novelty and glamour, that he'd grow out of it, that the daily texture of our life together, 18 years of it, couldn't be undone by a handful of Lakers tickets. I still believe that was mostly true. But I also know now that I underestimated something, how much a teenager wants on some primal level to be chosen by the parent who left. It's not about who did the work. It's about a wound that predates logic, and Renee, whether she understood it or not, had found the exact place to press. By his senior year, he was texting her regularly. She flew in for his graduation from high school, the first major life event of his she'd attended, and sat 2 rows behind us. And afterward, Caleb spent 20 minutes in the parking lot talking to her, while Tom and I waited by the car. And I remember Tom looking at me and saying, quietly, "Should we be worried about this?" And me saying, "No," in a voice that I mostly believed. Looking back, I think that graduation was the beginning of something I didn't have a name for yet. A slow recalibration happening in Caleb, where the mother who'd been absent his whole life started to represent freedom and glamour and a life untethered from struggle, while the mother who'd shown up every single day started to represent, without either of us intending it, the ordinary, the unremarkable, the given. It's a strange, cruel arithmetic, but I've come to understand it's not unusual. The people who do the most for us are often the easiest to take for granted, precisely because their love has never once been in question. I didn't know it yet, but that arithmetic was about to come due. College graduation should have been the best day of my life. In a lot of ways, for the first 2 hours, it was. I want to describe the morning honestly, because I think it matters. The small, ordinary happiness of it before everything else happened. I'd bought a new dress, pale blue, the first non-practical purchase I'd made for myself in longer than I want to admit. Tom wore the tie Caleb had picked out for him for Christmas 2 years earlier. We drove 4 hours to the university, and Caleb met us outside the stadium in his cap and gown, grinning, and hugged me first. First, before Tom, which I noticed and held on to like a small private gift. "You did it," I told him, my hands on his face like he was still 6 years old with a scraped knee. "You actually did." "We did it," he said, and I believed him. The ceremony itself was long, the way these things always are. Thousands of names read aloud in a stadium that smelled like sunscreen and hot asphalt. When they called his name, magna cum laude, a detail he'd downplayed on the phone because he didn't want to seem like he was bragging, Tom stood up before he could stop himself, clapping so hard his hands must have hurt, and I cried, unashamed, the good kind of crying. Afterward, there was a reception. Not a huge one, just family, held in a banquet room the university rented out for graduates whose families wanted a slightly more formal gathering than the parking lot picnics most people did. Tom had rented the room as a surprise, a bigger expense than we usually allowed ourselves, because he wanted Caleb to have a proper celebration. Renee was there. She'd flown in the night before. First time she'd made this kind of effort for anything, and I remember clocking that fact and choosing, deliberately, not to let it sour the day. She looked exactly like she always did in photos. Expensive, effortless, the kind of beautiful that comes from money and time, rather than genetics alone. She hugged Caleb for a long time when she arrived, longer than felt entirely natural, and I watched him hug her back with a kind of eagerness that I told myself, again, not to read too much into. About 45 minutes into the reception, Tom's brother, who'd flown in from Ohio and had appointed himself unofficial MC, tapped a fork against his glass and asked if anyone wanted to say a few words. There was a small portable microphone, more of a novelty than a necessity in a room that size, but it got passed around anyway. A nice touch, a way of making the moment feel official. Tom went first, and he was wonderful. A little clumsy with his words, the way he always was in front of groups, talking about Caleb's first day of kindergarten, about the fence-jumping incident, about how proud he was of the man his son had become. He didn't single me out by name in his speech, but he looked at me twice while he talked, and I understood those looks as an inclusion I didn't need spoken aloud. Then it was Caleb's turn. He stood up, mic in hand, a little flushed from the 2 glasses of champagne he probably shouldn't have had, and he talked for a minute or two about gratitude, about how none of this would have been possible without support, about how lucky he was to have people who believed in him. And then he said he wanted to make sure one person in particular knew how much this day meant. I remember, in the half-second before he said the next words, actually smiling, actually beginning to rise slightly in my seat, the way you do when you think a moment is about to be yours, the muscles already preparing themselves for the specific motion of standing to be embraced. He turned toward Renee. "I know it wasn't always been easy," he said, his voice catching in a way that read to the room as pure emotion. "But I'm so glad we found our way back to each other. This moment, this whole day, it belongs to my real family." And he handed her the microphone. I want to try to describe what that felt like, though I'm not sure I can do it justice. It wasn't like being slapped. A slap is fast, sharp, over in an instant. This was slower and stranger. Like watching from a great distance, a version of your own life quietly being edited without your consent. 18 years, condensed and discarded in the space of one sentence, in front of family, in a rented banquet room that Tom had paid for specifically so his son could have a beautiful day. Renee took the microphone with the practiced grace of someone who'd clearly been given center stage before and knew exactly what to do with it. She said something about being so proud, about second chances, about family finding its way back together. I don't remember the specifics, because by that point I had stopped fully hearing the words. I remember the room clapping. I remember Tom's hand finding mine under the table, gripping it hard enough that I understood, without looking at him, that he was as stunned as I was. I did not make a scene. I want to be very clear about that. Because I think there's a version of this story where the wronged woman stands up, says something cutting and cathartic, and the room falls silent in her favor. That's not what happened. And honestly, I don't think that's ever really how dignity works. What I did was smaller, and I think, in retrospect, more honest. I sat there through the rest of Renee's little speech, through the polite applause, through Caleb sitting back down next to her, at a table where I'd made the seating arrangement myself weeks earlier, carefully, so that he'd be between the 2 of us. I sat there for maybe 4 more minutes, long enough not to make my exit look like a direct reaction to what had just happened, though everyone in that room understood exactly what it was. Then I stood up, quietly, touched Tom's shoulder so he'd know I wasn't asking him to come with me, and I walked out of the banquet room, through the lobby, out into the parking lot, where I sat in the passenger seat of our car with the door shut and did not cry. Not right away. I just sat there, in my pale blue dress, in the heat, and thought about a boy on a porch step who wouldn't tell me his dinosaur's name until I proved I was worth telling. I thought, 18 years. I thought, 2 jobs. I thought, every semester, every gap he never knew existed, quietly closed by a woman he'd just described as not his real family, in a room full of people, on the happiest day of his life. I didn't think about the tuition account specifically, not in that moment. That would come later. In the parking lot, I wasn't thinking about money at all. I was thinking about a much older, much simpler math. The arithmetic of showing up, day after day for 18 years, and discovering that in the end, it apparently hadn't counted the way I thought it had. I sat there for 20 minutes before Tom found me. Tom didn't say much when he got in the car. He's not a man of many words in moments that call for exactly the right ones. And I think he understood, correctly, that nothing he could say right then would undo what had just happened. He just started the engine and said, "Do you want to go? Or do you want me to go back in and get our stuff?" "Go back in," I said. "I'll wait here." He was gone almost 20 minutes. Longer than it should have taken to gather 2 gift bags and a jacket. And when he came back, his jaw was tight in a way I recognized from the worst years of the recession, when the numbers wouldn't work no matter how he arranged them. He didn't tell me what was said in that room after I left. Not that day. And I didn't ask. I found out later that he'd pulled Caleb aside, briefly, and said something like, "You'll want to think about what you just did," which was, for Tom, about as sharp a rebuke as he was capable of delivering in public. We drove the 4 hours home, mostly in silence. Not an angry silence, an exhausted one. The kind that settles over 2 people who've just watched something break and don't yet know how to talk about the pieces. I didn't answer Caleb's calls for 2 days. I want to explain why, because I don't think it was spite, though I understand if it looked that way from the outside. I simply didn't have anything to say to him yet that wouldn't have come out as something I'd regret. I've never believed in saying things in anger that you can't take back, and in those first 48 hours, anger was mostly what I had. So I let the calls go to voicemail. I went to work. I came home and did ordinary things. Folded laundry, made dinner, watered the plants on the back porch. Because ordinary things were the only thing keeping me upright. Tom, for his part, was quieter than I'd seen him in years. I found out afterward that in those same 2 days, without telling me, he'd gone looking for something. He later said he wasn't even sure what, just some instinct that made him want to understand the full shape of what our son had just done. He started with the tuition statements, the ones that came to our house address every semester, the ones he'd always glanced at and filed away without much scrutiny because, as far as he knew, the financial aid and our home equity loan were covering the bulk of it, with him picking up whatever gap remained from his own overtime. He sat down one evening with 3 years of statements spread across the kitchen table, and for the first time really looked at the payment history, the account numbers, the recurring deposits from a savings account he didn't recognize, the semester-by-semester math that had never quite added up the way he assumed it had, because he'd never had reason to look closely. It didn't take him long to trace the account back. It was in my name. It always had been. He called me into the kitchen. I remember the look on his face. Not anger. Something closer to a kind of stunned grief. Like a man recalculating the shape of his own life in real time. "Diane," he said, "this account, you've been paying for almost half his tuition. For years!" I didn't deny it. There wasn't a version of that conversation where denying it made sense. "I picked up the hospital shifts," I said. "I didn't think it needed to be a whole conversation. You let me think." He stopped, ran a hand over his face. "You let me think I was the one making it work." "You were part of making it work," I said, and I meant it. I never wanted credit, Tom. That was never the point. He was quiet for a long time after that, and when he finally spoke again, his voice had gone rough in a way I'd only heard from him a handful of times in our marriage. He stood up in that room and said you weren't his real family, he said. And the whole time you were the one who put him through school. I didn't say anything because there wasn't anything satisfying to say. It wasn't a victory. It didn't feel like one. It just felt true in the plain, unglamorous way that most important things in a marriage eventually turn out to be true. Not with fireworks, but with a stack of statements on a kitchen table and a husband looking at you like he was seeing 18 years of quiet labor for the first time, all at once, and grieving that he hadn't seen it sooner. Tom drove out that same evening without telling me where he was going. I assumed, correctly, that he'd gone to see Caleb, who was staying at a friend's place for a few days before starting his post-graduation job search in earnest. I don't know everything that was said between them, That conversation belonged to the two of them, and I've never asked for a full transcript of it. But I know Tom laid the statements on the table in front of his son, the way he'd laid them on our kitchen table for me, and let the numbers speak in a way that words hadn't managed to at the reception. I know that Caleb went very quiet. I know that, according to Tom, he picked up one of the statements and stared at it for a long time, the way you look at something you should have recognized long ago and somehow never did. I found out later that Renee, when the story reached her second hand, had exactly nothing to say about it. There was no card, no call, no acknowledgement. Whatever brief chapter of real family she'd offered him at that reception had already, apparently, run its course. I don't say that with satisfaction. I say it because it's simply what happened. A fact of the story, not a twist I engineered. I want to be honest about something else, too, in this part. I didn't feel triumphant when Tom told me what he'd found, or when he told me what he'd said to Caleb. I felt tired, mostly, and sad. The specific sadness of realizing that something you built quietly and without complaint for nearly 2 decades had been so invisible to the person it was built for that he could stand in a room and hand it away to someone else with a straight face. Money, in the end, wasn't really what this was about, for me. It was about being seen. And for 3 days, I genuinely didn't know if I would be. Caleb showed up at our house 4 days after graduation, alone, without calling first, which was unlike him. He'd always been a texter, a planner, someone who gave advance notice out of habit. He knocked, and when I opened the door, he looked like he hadn't slept properly since the reception, which, as it turned out, he hadn't. I almost didn't let him say anything at first. I almost filled the silence myself, the way I always had, because 18 years of habit doesn't disappear over one bad afternoon. But I made myself stay quiet, and I let him find his own words, because I think some part of me understood that whatever came next needed to be entirely his, not something I'd smoothed the path for. "I've been thinking about the wrong thing my whole life," he said finally, standing on the porch. The same porch, though a different house by then, but a porch nonetheless. And I thought of the boy who wouldn't tell me his dinosaur's name, and how full circle a doorway can be. I kept thinking real family meant the person who was supposed to be there, like it was about biology or destiny or whatever, and I never really thought about the person who actually was there, every single day, even when it cost her something. "It didn't cost me, Caleb," I said, and I meant it more than he probably understood. It was never a cost. It was just what I did because I loved you. "That's the part I got wrong," he said, and his voice broke on it. "I thought love that doesn't ask for anything back must not be worth as much. Like it was, I don't know, too easy, too available. And I let someone who showed up a handful of times with a checkbook make me feel like that meant more than 18 years of you actually being there." I didn't say, "I told you so," because I never think that sentence has done a single good thing for anyone in the history of families. I didn't recite the list of everything I'd done, though God knows I could have. The ER visits, the third tree from the left school plays, the 2 a.m. spiders, the 6 years of night shifts. I didn't need to say it. He already knew, finally, in the particular way you only really know something once you've had to sit with the shame of almost losing it. What I did instead was step off the porch and hug him, the way I had 100 times before, the way I had when he was small enough to fit entirely against my chest and old enough now to nearly tower over me. And I let him cry, the way grown men rarely let themselves cry. And I said the only thing that felt true enough to say out loud. "You're still my son," I told him. That never stopped being true, not for 1 second, not even in that banquet room. You can't hand away 18 years with a sentence. It doesn't work that way. It's not that fragile. He apologized properly, later, at dinner, in front of Tom. Not a rushed, embarrassed mumble, but a real accounting, the kind that names the specific harm, rather than gesturing vaguely at regret. He said he understood now that real family was never a category some people qualified for and others didn't. It was a description of behavior, not blood, of who does the work, who stays, who shows up on the ordinary Tuesdays nobody remembers, which, it turns out, are the days that actually build a life. I won't pretend everything snapped back to how it was before the reception, as if nothing had happened. Trust doesn't work that cleanly, and I think it would be dishonest to tell you it did. There was a period, a few months, where things between us were careful in a way they'd never needed to be before. Polite, a little formal, both of us working consciously at something that used to be effortless. But we did the work, the same way I'd always done the work. And slowly, the ease came back. Slowly, it stopped feeling like something we were rebuilding and started, again, feeling like something we simply had. As for Renee, I don't have a satisfying dramatic ending to give you there. And I've come to believe that's its own kind of ending. She didn't call to apologize. She didn't reappear with an explanation. She simply receded again, the way weather does, back into whatever irregular pattern she'd always followed. And Caleb, for his part, stopped chasing the version of real family she represented, because he'd finally understood what it had actually cost him to reach for it. People sometimes ask me, when I tell this story, whether I regret keeping that account secret all those years, whether I should have made sure Caleb knew all along exactly what I was doing for him so that moment at the reception could never have happened in the first place. I've thought about that a great deal, and here's where I've landed. I don't think love that keeps a ledger is really love at all. I didn't want Caleb to owe me anything, or to feel obligated, or to think of my care as a debt with an itemized invoice attached. I wanted him to feel loved, full stop, without conditions or receipts. But I also think there's a difference between not demanding credit and disappearing so thoroughly into the background that you become invisible even to the people who depend on you most. I think if I were doing it again, I might let a little more of the truth show. Not for recognition, but because children, even grown ones, need to be able to see clearly who has actually stood in the room with them day after day, so they're not left vulnerable to anyone who shows up late with a checkbook and calls it love. Because here's what I know now, in a way I only half understood on that porch step 20 years ago. Real family was never about who gave birth to him. It was never about who had the money or the charm or the good timing to show up exactly when it would make the biggest impression. It was about who kept showing up when there was nothing impressive about it at all. The fevers, the flat tires, the 2 a.m. spiders, the 6 years of night shifts nobody saw. That's not a sacrifice. That's not even generosity. Not really. That's just what love looks like, when nobody's handing you a microphone to say so.